When we first came to this neighborhood, we invited people to have coffee with us, and nobody came. And finally, Maggie Villanueva came in kind of carefully and sat down with us and talked a little bit, and then she left. And we found out later that the neighborhood had she was the president of the PTA, that the neighborhood had selected her to find out who we were. Were we Jehovah's Witnesses or drug dealers or what? And so she went out with a report, and then gradually people began to come in. We had folk from the community who took on different roles with us, who became part of our staff. The community is still part of our staff, part of our board. We intended to listen and respond to what folk told us, and we've done our best to do that. I'm Bill Schlesinger, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Project Vida Health Center and the Co-Director of Project Vida and PV Community Development Corporation. There is a center to life. There are not boundaries. It's not like you draw a circle and you're either in or out. It's kind of like gravity. Have you ever seen those attempts to sketch gravity where it's kind of like you've got a bowling ball and a bed and it pulls you in? So there's a center. What's the center about? For me, it's about three things. At the center of life, you're never frozen. There is forgiveness, release, freedom. You're never locked in. There is compassion. Compassion literally means to feel with, which is unity, which means you feel with everybody. You are part of a continuum of creation and humanity, and you're pulled into that linkage. And there is responsibility, that you can't cut off any part of life and say, not my problem. That it's all our responsibility. So it's not about being the best agency, or even, and forbid it, being a better agency than somebody else. It's about how do we be responsible for all of this thing, which means figuring out how to be responsible for the other agencies we work with, for the community that we live in, for the governmental system that we're part of, for the culture and ethnicities that we share. That's, for me, the center. Forgiveness, compassion, responsibility. And that pulls us in. It doesn't create silos. It doesn't give us a sense of us versus them. It's a central focus of all that we do. We're a Presbyterian Church organization sponsored by the Presbyterian Church USA and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church from their context of providing ministry, mission on the border. And the intent was to see how the church could be a servant of this community and all communities along the border. So we started with looking for a piece of geography that had limits to it, that had boundaries, that you could kind of get your hands around, where there was visible need, where nobody else was working in that area, and where there was an invitation, where people would invite us in to come and work with them. So we looked at several areas. We looked at Montana Vista, we looked at the Lower Valley, and we looked at this part of central El Paso, and this is where we found all those conditions met about 1990. When we moved into this area, it was bounded on the north by I-10, on the east by the Patriot Expressway, on the west by Cotton, and on the south by the border. The leadership of the school and the leadership of some of the churches said, yes, we could use some help in here. There's nobody else actually developing a program in this part of the area. When we came in, we spent about 2 years just drinking coffee with people and asking them what their vision was for the community, what was blocking that vision from happening, and what they saw as directions to take to begin to move the community down the road. We did surveys, we did door knocking, we did small groups, we did conversations. During that time, we did some small activities. We had kids in for after school. We had a small thrift shop. We had events that people could come in and learn about English. We did a very small early childhood program with a retired kindergarten teacher. As that process played out, the serious issues that came bubbling up had to do with access to health care. It had to do with housing, with education, with gang prevention, and finally economic development. Those were the areas that the community felt were challenges and where they wanted to see programs developed. We moved into this area and saw that we had to deal with all of the ages, because each age of people interacts with the other in a way that changes things. So if you just deal with kids, the parents don't understand what you're doing, and the parents then can undo what you've done with the kids and tell them, no, you're not good enough to go to school, you're not good enough to go to college, you're not strong enough to leave here and do something, other work that you want to do. You need to just fit into our old patterns. If you just work with the parents, then the kids are kind of running loose and they're not part of it and they don't understand it. You've got to work with the grandparents, the parents, the kids, all ages, to begin to build and shape a community that has a sense of itself and its ability to move forward. And you have to work with all problem areas. You have to work with economics, with culture, with how people make decisions, and that's what we mean by politics. You can't just take a part of the community and address it, because every part of the community interacts with every other part of the community. So in the list of concerns that came out from the community, they all interrelated. Housing interrelated with healthcare, because if you were living in a place that didn't have heat, had broken windows, had vermin in it, you were not going to stay healthy. Economic development related to education. If you didn't have a basis to bring money into the family, it was hard to get your kids to move along into higher education. Education was related to gang prevention. If you understood that you lived in a wider world, you were less likely to be attracted to the kinds of options that were afforded you by the street gangs. When we moved in here, this area was the center of retail heroin. This is where you came to get your drugs. Now, it's not here anymore. And it's not because we took on the heroin dealers, it's because the community changed. Because people began to look around and see what was going on, began to open up beyond their houses, began to see that they could be involved in the community, and that just is not the environment that dealers want to live in. And so they've moved on. We were never attacked by the dealers because we were treating their grandparents. We were treating their relatives. So we weren't the enemy, we were just part of a community. And that community is what resolved the issues here. So we did access to health care, we did our clinic program, housing, We took condemned and blighted houses and converted them into multifamily living areas. We did two things when we did that. We addressed healthcare issues, actually three things. We addressed safety issues, because that's where a lot of the shooting galleries were, and we addressed housing. So when we could combine that with the other programs, it was stronger. Education, we focused on early childhood. That was where we saw the possibility of developing change. But along with that, we did parenting programs right from the start. So you worked with both the family and the child, and you helped them develop. When we started here, the kids were little kids being in really small apartments. If the kid fussed, baby fussed, they would give them something to eat or something to drink to quiet them down. Because in these little tiny apartments, there was no privacy. So if a child was fussy, it bothered everybody. Well, when you do that to a child, when you de-stimulate and you calm them down, you actually are stopping brain development. Brain development comes from interaction, comes from stimulus. So when you take stimulus away to quiet the child over and over and over again, you also affect their teeth, because you're giving them something to suck on, something to drink with sugar in it. And so we were seeing a lot of tooth decay in the kids. So the early childhood development was not just about education and reading and learning to interact. It was also about teaching the parents the different ways to raise their child so that the child was stimulated instead of destimulated. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it related to healthcare, it related to pediatrics, it related to education, and it related to future economic development. Gang prevention. We couldn't take on the gangs directly, didn't want to, not our job. What we did was take on the kids who didn't want to do that. And so we created safe space where kids could drop in. We made it attractive, and then we made it enriching, so that the kids that were coming got to access computers, reading, crafts, group activities, visits to other places outside of this. A lot of the kids thought of life as 4 square blocks. And within 4 square blocks, the gangs had a whole lot of things to offer. But as the kids got into a wider world, they began to see additional options, other choices they could make. So they were given an option, and that was what our after-school program did. Economic development, we saw that we had a whole bunch of folk who knew their product or knew their service. They didn't know how to work a business. They didn't know their basic bookkeeping skills were not there. They were doing left pocket, right pocket. If I've got money, I can spend it. If I don't, I can't. But they didn't track what they were doing very carefully. They would offer pricing on a job that covered the cost of materials. They didn't count their own labor as a cost. And so they were just kind of churning what they were doing. We had developed a community health worker program early on in our healthcare program. Community health workers go out, they identify with people, give education, they do training activities, and they build relationships of trust. So we took that approach and we flipped it into microenterprise development. So we had Mario Mendoza, built relationships with people. He's brilliant at doing that. He is a warm, encompassing person. The other people that work in the program, the same way. Luz, Mario, and Rosario, and Herrera, Claudio, they've all developed that kind of capacity. The businesses then begin to trust them and open up. And these are like mom and pop shops. This is a guy who's trying to be a mechanic. This is a woman who is selling burritos in front of a Walmart. And they would talk about what they could do and what they couldn't do. They would teach them some basic bookkeeping skills. They'd bring folks together to do business-to-business conversations. This thing has generated 60 jobs, new jobs, every year in the last 10 years. It's a long-standing program. It's a model for how other people could do this kind of work on the border. We were part of a group that went to every county in Texas. And we did a meeting in that community that asked, where do you want to go? What's in the way? What can we do to move things along? What can this community do to move things along? So we took that methodology and applied it to this area and then to other areas. So the Community Congress is a way to bring a lot of folk together in a relatively brief period of time, 2 to 3 hours, where instead of long speeches from the front of the room, you gather information from the folk that are in the room. And we do that with small sheets of paper where people write down 3 to 5 word phrases about where they'd like to be in 5 years. And then we cluster those pieces of paper to see what the patterns are that represent what's in the room. And then the same thing on what are the obstacles and what could we do to move forward. So you try to pull the information out of the room, out of the folks that are sitting there, that give you a picture of that community's vision, of its own understanding of what the obstacles are, and of what that community sees as a way to move. We never took those as automatic. We took those and then tried to see through them to what was possible. So one of the first things that we did in this community was people said, we need our own hospital. Well, we're not going to do a hospital. But we saw that they wanted something that actually delivered health care. So we could start a small clinic, and that's what we did. And then as we got the clinic going, we said, well, what are the obstacles? And we began to see the obstacles becoming clearer and clearer, that people weren't able to keep their own health together because of their own depression about their health. And so we figured, okay, we've got to deal with behavioral health. And then that mode became internalized as well. Where are we trying to get? What's stopping us from getting there? How do we deal with it? What we found was that a lot of groups focused on the vision really well in community meetings, but they never addressed the obstacles. So they never saw what was in the way, and that never got discussed. And as a result, they'd get hit in the back of the head by the things they hadn't talked about in the meeting. So that was the focus of the Community Congress, was not just to get the vision, but also to try to figure out where the obstacles were, which gave us then permission to address the obstacles, as well as move towards the vision. We approach change in this community by starting at really small levels. We did a clinic, which was literally one room, and it was Roger Nafsker and seeing people. We did an after-school program that was in one room. We had a duplex house, and for the first several years, we did everything inside that house. We had a small thrift shop that a neighborhood folk ran. We had the clinic that Roger did. We had an after-school program. We had an early childhood program. They were tiny. And bit by bit, we began to see that folks began to trust that. And so we began to reach out. We reached out to the city for funding to get the clinic going. Then we went back to the city and we asked for more funds for early childhood. We tied in with the AmeriCorps program and the Vista programs, and a lot of our early staff were part of the AmeriCorps Vista or the AmeriCorps service programs. Gloria Marmolejo, who's still with us, Irma Avila, who's still with us, all came through that kind of a program. We expanded just kind of step by step in collaborating with the city, with other agencies, and figuring out how to build on resources. Project Vida is not built on the idea that you do one thing and do it well. It's built on the idea that you do things that help communities move forward. Those are complex things. There are lots of things that are interrelated when it comes to a community. Communities see themselves in a certain way, and that shapes what they're willing to do. Buildings shape how people see themselves. resources make a difference. All those things play back and forth. When we first came into this neighborhood, the neighborhood saw itself as forgotten. They saw that they had been kind of set aside. There was stuff going on in Segundo Barrio. There was stuff going on in other parts of the city, and this area just felt empty to the folks that were here. We had women homemakers whose entire life was focused on keeping the cleanest house on the block, and that's all they did. They were very narrow in the world that they saw themselves living in. So it wasn't enough to do things. We also had to figure out how to get people to see themselves differently, to see the kind of gift that they really were, and the kind of resource that they had available to offer others, as well as the needs they had for their own development. There is such a wide range. Stuff like, don't lie. Tell the truth. It's easier to fix a problem if you know what it is than if you try to hide it. We try not to do shame and blame stuff, but to say, let's get issues on the table and solve them, and do that together. That it's better to have more minds at the table to look at the different issues and their solutions than it is to have one person doing it. And so we tend, one of our values is we don't try to catch people in gotchas, but we try to get the issues clear so that they can be focused on and resolved, instead of deciding who is right. We try to figure out what is right, and we try to move in that direction. Another value is that we try to tie things together. So if somebody comes in and they need or are interested in healthcare, we also try to let that person know about the wider range of services that are available, and figure out how do our housing programs reflect wellness, and how does wellness reflect education and empowerment of folk. So it's not what we do to somebody, but how we form a community of care that works together. And that's both internally within our staff and externally. And we don't succeed all the time. We had some horrible, horrible failures. We've had people who were abusive to other folk, controlling, and by the time we found out about it, there'd been a lot of damage done. So it's not like we're perfect. We have some basic theological guidelines that I talk about. Sometimes people remember them, sometimes they don't. Total depravity. Everybody's screwed up. Let's deal with it. Unconditional election. No matter how screwed up you are, you're still called to be responsible. Limited atonement. This is a classic, which is basically that some people are going to get it and some people aren't, and you can't tell the difference. Irresistible grace. Everybody is beloved. Period. Perseverance of the saints. Once you've wakened up, you can't go back to sleep. You can do a lot of damage to yourself and other people, but you can't go back to sleep. So those are some of the kind of core value screens that we operate with. I expect people to learn and grow. I expect people to figure out their journey. Part of that journey is here. Part of it may be somewhere else. That's okay. I expect staff to be brave and not to operate out of fear, and to say what they are going to do and do what they say, and be open and transparent about it. And I expect staff to care about our clients.